Hey guys, tonight we begin with the vibrant and complex world of English folklore. We will explore everything from mischievous fairies and household spirits to legendary heroes like King Arthur, and even touch on a bit of magical practice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome, everyone, to the channel History 00000 AM. Let's get straight to the story. The first thing to understand is that English folklore is not one single simple thing. It springs from a deep confluence of cultural streams, a slow mixing of beliefs over thousands of years. Long before England ever existed as a unified kingdom, the land's inhabitants, from the Celtic Britons to the later Anglo-Saxon and Norse settlers, all spun their own myths and tales. Each group brought their own gods, their own fears, and their own ways of explaining the world. The Celtic legends, for instance, proved remarkably stubborn. Many of them survived the arrival of Christianity by simply blending into the local lore, changing their shape just enough to be recorded by medieval writers. The most famous example, of course, is the legend of King Arthur. He has his roots in early Welsh and Breton traditions long before he became the shining knight in armor we think of today. He was a hero, a warrior, a defender of the Britons against the invading Saxons. Medieval chroniclers noted that the common Britons widely believed that Arthur never truly died. They believed he was sleeping, perhaps in a cave or on the magical Isle of Avalon, waiting until Britain's most dire hour to return. This deep-seated hope was first recorded as a widespread belief by the historian William of Malmesbury in 1125. He remarked, with a little bit of scholarly skepticism, that Arthur's grave is nowhere to be seen, which is why old fables still claim he will return. Imagine that for a moment. Picture yourself in a damp, smoky hall in the 11th century. The fire in the center pit pops and sputters, stinging your eyes, but it does little to fight the bone-deep chill of the rain lashing against the wooden walls. A traveling storyteller is speaking, his voice rising and falling, and he tells you that your great king is not gone, just sleeping. In a world of hardship and conquest, that single story is a spark of warmth, a fierce, secret hope that you carry with you. This motive, the once and future king, shows just how powerfully folklore could preserve these pre-Norman Celtic legends, even hiding them within the pages of a Latin chronicle. Then, with the Anglo-Saxon settlement in the 5th and 6th centuries, new layers were added to the mix. They brought their own Germanic gods, figures like Woden, the one-eyed Allfather, and Thunor, the powerful god of thunder. And you might recognize their more famous Norse names, Odin and Thor. They also brought their own heroic sagas and a very strong belief in elves and giants, and crucially, in fate. Although Christian missionaries successfully converted the Anglo-Saxons by the 7th century, the old faith did not just vanish overnight. Traces of it persisted for centuries, hiding in the safest place it could find, within folklore and folk medicine. We see this clearly in Anglo-Saxon charms written in Old English. And these texts are fascinating because they show pagan elements surviving right alongside Christian prayers. One healing charm, for example, designed to fight poison, actually invokes Woden himself to strike the serpent, mixing his name with Christian ritual. It is a wonderful example of hedging your bets. You might as well call on any god who might be listening, especially when you feel the poison spreading, a cold numbness creeping up your arm. Another Old English charm gives advice on what to do if a horse or even a person is elfscotten. This wonderful word, elfshot, describes a sudden, mysterious affliction. Perhaps it's a sharp stitch in your side that takes your breath away, or a sudden lameness in your best ox. You look around, but there is nothing there, just the still air of the forest edge or the quiet of the barn. You feel a creeping dread, a cold prickle on your skin, because you know an invisible arrow has struck you, shot by a malignant unseen elf. This wasn't a fairy tale. To the Anglo-Saxons, elves were often feared as real and dangerous beings who could inflict harm from their parallel world. To cure this elf shot, the charm prescribed a special herbal salve, but also a set of magic words. Historians still debate whether these charms represent a genuine, active survival of pagan religious belief, or if the monks who wrote them down simply saw them as old-fashioned, traditional remedies, their original divine meaning already fading into simple superstition. Either way, this blending of old magic and new faith became a hallmark of English folk tradition. This process of mixing and matching continued. The Norman conquest of 1066 added French feudal culture and its own stories to the mix, at least among the new aristocracy, but the common folk, the people working the land, they clung to their old stories. Minstrels at court might sing new romances, but the village storyteller still spoke of giants and elves. Sometimes medieval writers would capture this genuine folklore almost by accident. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing his grand history of the kings of Britain in 1136, preserved the ancient legend of Corneus, a companion of the Trojan Brutus, who supposedly founded Britain. The story goes that Corneus wrestled a Cornish giant named Gog-Magog, and in a great feat of strength hurled him from a high cliff into the sea. Geoffrey even claimed that a cliff in Devon was still called the Giant's Leap, in memory of this mythic battle. We can just picture Geoffrey in his quiet monastery, the only sound the scratch of his quill on the vellum, the air thick with the smell of ink and old parchment. He is writing in formal Latin, creating a grand history for his patrons, but he is recording a wild, rough, breathless story he heard from the countryside, a tale of two massive figures grappling on a windy cliff edge with the roar of the sea far below. Likewise, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for the year 793 describes the terrible omens that came before the first great Viking raid on the monastery at Lindisfarne. The chronicler notes that people saw immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons flying in the air. This is a stunning image, fiery dragons streaking across the skies of Northumbria. It shows how people interpreted natural phenomena, perhaps a comet or a vivid display of the aurora borealis, through a folkloric lens. To them, these were not natural lights, they were dragons, and they were harbingers of doom. This blending of the natural and supernatural was how folklore provided an explanatory framework for the world. By the time of Geoffrey Chaucer in the late 14th century, educated English society was well aware of this tension. In his famous Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath wryly observes that the land was filled with fairies in the old days of King Arthur, but now no one sees elves anymore, because the holy friars, with all their blessings, have driven them out. This little joke shows that people still believed in fairies, but they also knew the official church position, that such things were gone or perhaps never existed. But despite that official disapproval, the belief in fairies and a whole host of other creatures certainly thrived among ordinary people, preserved in their fireside stories on long, dark nights. So let's talk about one of the most charming aspects of English folklore, at least in my opinion, and that's all the fairies and little folk. But we need to get one thing straight right away. Far from the diminutive, shimmering winged sprites you see in Victorian fairy paintings or in modern Disney films, medieval English fairies were something else entirely. They were diverse, sometimes helpful, often dangerous, but always profoundly otherworldly. The very word fairy actually comes to English from the Old French fairy. In medieval use, it didn't just refer to a being, it referred to enchantment itself, to the realm of the fays, the supernatural folk. Natural, it was a word for magic, for the uncanny, for a world that existed just alongside our own, usually invisible. In local legends, these beings were often unseen presences that one had to appease to avoid their wrath. Chaucer's reference, "Remember that one," suggests that people believed fairies roamed the land much more freely in earlier pre-Christian times, especially in wild places. They belonged to the deep woods, the lonely hills, the ancient ruins, and they were most active at night. Indeed, a common theme in English folklore is that fairies and elves began to withdraw from the world as Christianity advanced, as more churches were built and more bells rang out over the fields. They were said to linger only in the most remote hills or desolate ruins, the last pockets of the old world. Yet, for the medieval peasant, this was not some abstract theological idea. Fairies were a practical and sometimes terrifying reality. You might blame fairies for a changeling child. Imagine the horror of that, looking into the cradle at your infant who has suddenly become strange, sickly, and voracious. with an old, knowing look in its eyes. You feel a cold dread rise in your throat, the air in the cottage suddenly feeling thin and cold because, you just know this is not your child. This is a fairy stock, a withered old fairy left in your baby's place. Or, on the other hand, you might seek a fairy blessing for a newborn, leaving a small offering of milk or bread by the hearth, hoping to gain their favor. English folklore distinguishes several types of these fairy-like creatures. Elves, in the Anglo-Saxon belief system, were definitely not Tolkien's noble, wise beings. As we touched on earlier, they were often seen as malevolent, spiteful sprites responsible for causing illness. The Anglo-Saxons truly feared elf shot, those invisible arrows that caused sudden stabbing pains or mysterious sicknesses. We have surviving charms from texts like the Lacnunga that detail complex rituals to cure it. The remedy might involve a special salve made of herbs gathered at a specific time, mixed with singing a psalm and perhaps a few older, less Christian-sounding words. This shows a very real medical, magical approach to a problem people believed was caused by invisible attackers. Historians still debate whether these elves were a folk memory of diminished pagan deities, a personification of disease, or perhaps a distinct class of nature spirit. Whatever their origin, they were not to be trifled with. By the later Middle Ages, the words elf and fairy seem to have been used more interchangeably. Generally, people imagine them as humanoid magical beings, often human-sized or slightly smaller, living in their own parallel realm or kingdom, a place that sometimes crossed over with our own, especially at twilight or on magical nights, like Midsummer's Eve. Folk tradition held that leaving small offerings could attract the more benevolent fairies, or at least avert their mischief. For example, you might see those rings of mushrooms that pop up in the grass overnight. These were widely believed to be fairy rings, marking the spot where fairies had danced in a circle all night. You can almost smell the damp earth and the sharp fungal scent of the mushrooms, and in the pre-dawn quiet, you might strain your ears, thinking you can just barely hear the faint, reedy sound of their music fading on the wind. Prudent folk would never, ever mow or disturb these rings. To do so was to invite terrible bad luck. It was a strange and unusual rule, but one that was followed, just in case. Offending the unseen dancers was a risk no sensible farmer was willing to take. But more intimate than the wild fairies of the fields were the household spirits. These were the beings known as hobgoblins, or perhaps more famously, brownies. These spirits were thought to dwell right inside the homes and barns of ordinary people. Their entire purpose, it seemed, was to help with chores during the night, but only in exchange for a small, regular payment. A typical English farmer's family might speak of our hob or the brownie in the barn, with a mixture of weariness and genuine affection. The brownie, especially in northern England and Scotland, was described in very specific ways. He was not a beautiful winged sprite. He was usually described as a small, ragged, hairy little man. Imagine creeping downstairs in the middle of the night for a drink of water. The cottage is pitch black, silent, save for the wind. You reach the hearth where the embers are glowing faintly red, and you see him just for a second. He is small, covered in rough brown hair, and smells faintly of damp earth, sour milk, and the straw from the barn. You freeze, the cold stone floor biting into your bare feet. He looks at you with ancient knowing eyes, then vanishes into the shadows. You stand there, your heart pounding, wondering if you really saw anything at all. The brownie would come out only after everyone was asleep. You're huddled under the blankets, the wool scratching your chin. The fire is just embers. But then you hear it. Swish, swish, swish. The sound of the broom sweeping the stone floor, steady and rhythmic. Then thump, churn, thump, churn. Someone is working the butter churn in the pantry. It is a comforting sound, the sound of magic working in your favor. You pull the blankets tighter, smiling in the dark, knowing the brownie is earning his cream. As payment, he expected that bowl of cream or a crust of good bread or some fresh milk left for him on the hearth. And that payment, that bowl of cream, it had to be the best. Think of the smell of fresh warm milk, straight from the cow, thick with fat, or the crust of bread, not a stale old piece, but one with a bit of honey on it. The brownie had standards. It sounds like a pretty good deal, honestly. I think I could use one of those, especially for washing dishes. I would definitely leave out a bowl of milk for that. a very good deal indeed. If you honored this simple bargain and left him his due, the whole household thrived. The butter churned faster, the livestock stayed healthy, and things just seemed to work properly. But if you managed to offend him, well, that is when things got bad. He would not just leave. He might turn into a malicious poltergeist, as something we will get to very soon. And brownies were notoriously sensitive. They were incredibly easy to offend. You must never ever offer overt thanks. You just leave the food and pretend you do not know who did the work. And worst of all, the absolute cardinal sin was to offer a brownie a gift of clothing. This was the ultimate insult, a very odd and unusual detail of the folklore. There's a popular tale that illustrates this perfectly. It goes that a well-meaning farmer, feeling generous, left a new suit of clothes, perhaps a little linen shirt and some breeches, for his hard-working brownie. The brownie found the clothes, put them on, and capered about with pride. But then he vanished forever, shouting that he would work no more, as he was now a gentleman. Talk about a good deed backfiring. Indeed, this tradition is incredibly strong across Britain. Folklore universally holds that giving a fairy clothes sets it free or banishes it. Historians still debate the origin of this peculiar belief. Some argue it is a symbolic representation of breaking the unspoken contract by offering formal payment, a wage instead of a casual gift or offering. Others suggest it relates to older ideas about wildness versus civilization, that clothing the spirit tames it and drives away its magical nature. Perhaps you just raised an eyebrow. Yes, that is the exact motive echoed in the house elf Dobby in the Harry Potter stories, which of course draws heavily on these older English legends. That idea of a sock setting a servant free is pure, old-fashioned folklore. Think about the sound of that, the silence of the house when the brownie is gone. The next morning the farmer comes down. The hearth is cold. The bowl of cream is untouched. There is no sound of sweeping, no clatter of dishes, just a heavy, empty silence. The floor feels gritty underfoot, and the air in the kitchen feels stagnant and heavy. The good luck has drained out of the house, all because of a tiny, well-intentioned gift. In medieval eyes, this was not just a fantasy story for children. These beliefs were not dismissed as simple superstitions. They were real, practical explanations for the daily flow of household luck. If things suddenly went missing or the milk turned sour for 3 days straight, the immediate thought was that the brownie had been slighted. You would be frantically trying to remember, what did I do? What did I say? But if the floors mysteriously gleamed in the morning or the butter churned in half the time, you knew the helpful hob or brownie had been at work. You would just smile to yourself and make sure to leave an extra nice piece of bread out that night without saying a word. Now, let's talk about the hob, which is short for hobgoblin. This is essentially the English version of the brownie, though the term hobgoblin often implies a slightly more goblin-like, perhaps uglier appearance. A hobgoblin might be more grotesque, maybe with rougher skin, more like bark or stone. When you think of him, you do not just think of a helpful spirit. You think of the feeling of something coarse brushing past you in the dark, the sharp, earthy smell of a cave, and the unsettling feeling of being watched by someone who is not quite human. He might be helpful, but he was still a goblin. But like the brownie, the hobgoblin's primary role was domestic. He was a household spirit first and foremost. Reginald Scott, writing in his Discovery of Witchcraft in 1584, though that is a bit later, he summarized the common belief of his time, which was rooted in these medieval ideas. He said that the hobgoblin would help the maids grind malt or mustard and sweep the house at night. He described him as a drudge who, for his pains, would get a mess of milk, bread, and butter. But Scott also noted that if the maid or good wife of the house forgot his payment, he would pinch them black and blue while they slept. That is a vivid image. You wake up in the dark, the straw mattress rustling under you, a sharp, stinging pain erupts on your arm. You yelp and swat at the empty air, but there's nothing there. In the morning, you find a dark, ugly bruise the size of a thumbprint, a painful reminder that you forgot to leave out the cream. The feeling of that phantom pinch would be a powerful motivator. So the hobgoblin was helpful, but he had an edge. He was a laborer, not a pet. He expected his wages, and he would enact a penalty if he did not get them. This belief was a perfect way to enforce household diligence. It was not just you being lazy, you were risking the wrath of the hob. These beliefs were intensely local. Different regions had their own names for this spirit. In Kent, he might be a hob. In the north, a brownie. In other places, he was just Loblai by the fire, a name that perfectly captures his domestic nature, a lazy but powerful spirit who lounged by the hearth. This highlights the ambiguity of these spirits. They lived on a knife's edge between being helpful and being harmful. As long as the relationship was balanced, everything was fine. But the moment that balance was upset, the helpful hob could become something much, much worse. Now, what happened when you truly offended one of these household spirits, when you forgot the cream one too many times, or worse, offered them those dreadful clothes? The helpful brownie, that cozy Loblai by the fire, would not just leave. In the folklore of northern England, particularly in Lancashire and Yorkshire, it was said he would turn, he would become a boggart. A boggart was essentially a brownie who had lost his temper, and this was not a simple tantrum. This was a permanent, malicious transformation. The boggart was a malevolent household spirit, almost indistinguishable from a poltergeist. If a brownie's presence felt like a secret warmth, a boggart's was a creeping, sour cold. You would walk into a room and the air would feel thick and stagnant. The back of your neck would prickle. You would catch the faint, sharp smell of soured milk or something vaguely rotten, even when the kitchen was clean. The boggart's entire purpose was to create chaos and misery for the family that had slighted it. He would bang doors in the dead of night, a sharp crack that jolted you from sleep. Dishes would fly from the shelves, smashing on the stone floor when no one was in the room. You would be sitting by the fire, the only light in the cottage, and feel a sudden sharp pinch on your arm, like a wasp sting, making you cry out. But the worst, as the stories tell it, was the feeling of it in your bed at night. You would be deep in sleep, only to be woken by a heavy, cold pressure on your chest, as if a large, unseen dog had settled on you, making it hard to breathe. You would lie there, paralyzed with terror, the straw mattress rustling beside you until the pressure finally lifted. Families tormented by a boggart sometimes tried to escape it. They would pack up their meager belongings and move to a new house, hoping to leave the spirit behind. But it was rarely that simple. A famous and rather sad Lancashire tale tells of a farmer who was doing just that. He had loaded his cart with all his furniture and goods and was leaving his farm, only to hear a small voice call out from inside the big milk churn he was carrying. The voice said, "Aye, we're flittin', are we?" The farmer knew then it was hopeless. The boggart was coming with them. Historians still debate whether boggarts were always considered a turned brownie, or if they were sometimes seen as a distinct type of malicious spirit that could infest a house from the start. But the stories that warn of offending the brownie are far more numerous, serving as a powerful lesson in reciprocity. But not all mischievous spirits were domestic. Out in the wild, in the woods and moors, you had a different kind of trickster. The most famous example is Robin Goodfellow, also known as Puck. Yes, this is the very same Puck that William Shakespeare immortalized in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But Shakespeare did not invent him. He drew on a very real and very old folkloric figure. In medieval English folklore, the name Puck or Pook was simply an old word for an impish spirit, sometimes even a demon. Puck, or Robin Goodfellow, was the trickster of the countryside, the very spirit of things going wrong outside the home. His main hobby was leading travelers astray at night. This experience was so common, it had its own name, to be puck-led or pixie-led. Imagine you are walking home from the next village. The sun has set, and a thick, clammy fog is rising from the ground, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. The path you have walked 100 times suddenly looks unfamiliar. You hear a sound, like a giggle or the snap of a twig, just behind you. You turn, but there is nothing there. You keep walking, but the trees seem to move. The path twists back on itself. Thorns snag at your cloak, and the marshy ground seems to suck at your boots. You are walking in circles, and all the while you feel like you are being watched. That is the feeling of being puck-led. An odd detail comes from a 17th century ballad, which pulls from these older beliefs. In it, Puck boasts of his exploits, his ability to shapeshift into a horse, a dog, or a harmless fire, all to mislead night wanderers. But just to keep things complicated, Puck also had a dual nature. He was not always malicious. Like a hobgoblin, he could sometimes be helpful. If he was in a good mood, he might do housework, or churn butter, or drive away pests from the farm. This unpredictability is what made him so dangerous. You never knew which version you were going to get. This figure was not unique to England either. The Irish puka and the Welsh pwca are very similar beings, tricksters and shapeshifters of the wild. This reinforces that such nature sprites were part of a much older shared Pan-Celtic and English fairy tradition. Of course, the church did not approve of any of this. Medieval records like the notes from local church synods occasionally mention peasants being warned against the superstitious practice of leaving milk or food out for elves, fairies, or pukas, but how could you ever stamp that out? How could a priest check every farmhouse hearth every single night? As long as people were not openly worshiping these things, the church mostly tolerated it, even if it frowned on the practice. It was a secret domestic negotiation with the unseen world, a world of spirits that were sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, and always unpredictable. So we have these spirits in the house, but then there were the outdoor fairies, the ones who had nothing to do with humanity at all. They inhabited the groves, the ancient hills, and the bubbling springs. These were not beings you could bargain with for a bit of housework. Many an isolated place in England has a legend of fairy inhabitants. Barrows, those ancient burial mounds that dot the countryside, were almost universally believed to be fairy hills or elf hills. You can imagine a medieval farmer plowing his field, giving a wide berth to the looming green mound at the edge. He would never dare cut the turf there. He would have heard stories of travelers passing by at midsummer and hearing strange, beautiful music wafting from inside the hill. You can just picture it. The air is warm and heavy with the scent of wildflowers. The moon is full, and you hear the thin, reedy piping music. It is so enchanting. It makes your heart ache, and you feel a pull, a desperate urge to find its source, to dig into the mound. But you would not. You would cross yourself and hurry home, your skin cold with sweat despite the summer heat, because everyone knew that to stumble into their world was to be lost forever. Folklore held that time passed strangely in fairyland. A man might enter a fairy hill, dance for what felt like one night, and emerge to find 100 years had passed. His village would be gone, his family dust. This is an incredibly common and very odd detail, this temporal distortion. It is a recurring theme in medieval romance literature, like the tale of Sir Orfeo or Sir Launfal, where knights encounter fairy queens and are taken to otherworldly palaces. These literary tales were likely reflecting much older, simpler folk tales of ordinary people stumbling into fairy revels and being lost. We can even circle back to Chaucer's Wife of Bath's tale, which mentions the elf queen and her merry company dancing around in the meadows in the old days. These literary mentions show that the belief in a parallel fairy world hidden in the hills and wild places was widespread. Now, an intriguing class of fairy beings, though admittedly less well-developed in English lore compared to Celtic lands, are the water spirits. English counties do have their share of river hags and mere legends. They just are not as famous as the Selkies of Scotland. What was that? You want me to dust a Scottish folklore video? You better leave your thoughts in the comments about that. Well, in northern England, parents had a very effective way of keeping children away from dangerous ponds and rivers. They warned them about Jenny Greenteeth. Jenny Greenteeth was a green-skinned water hag with long, sharp teeth who lurked just below the surface, hidden among the pondweed. You can imagine a child playing near the water's edge. The air is still, and the pond is covered in a thick green blanket of duckweed. It smells stagnant, a thick, swampy odor of mud and decay. The child leans over to look at a frog, and suddenly a cold, bony hand, green and webbed, shoots out of the water and grabs their ankle. The cold is shocking, a powerful, icy grip that pulls them down into the dark, suffocating mud before they can even scream. That is the terror of Jenny Greenteeth. A perfect story to keep children far, far away from the water. In the eastern counties, the mysterious phenomenon of the will-o'-the-wisp, those flickering, ghostly lights seen over marshes, was attributed to a mischievous sprite. Sometimes it was a pixie, sometimes it was just called a hobby lantern. This creature, much like Puck, would lead travelers off the safe path and deep into the dangerous boggy swamp. Though these water spirits are less personified, they are definitely part of the fairy ecology, creatures of the dangerous, wet, wild places. Finally, for this section, we have to talk about how folklore often blurred the line between fairies and the dead. Historians still debate the true origin of fairies in British folklore. Are they diminished pagan deities, as some Victorian scholars argued? Are they personifications of nature? Or, as some evidence suggests, are they a folk memory of the dead? In medieval ghost stories, apparitions of the dead sometimes appear in a form we would recognize as a fairy host. And for instance, Orderic Vitalis, an English monk writing in Latin in the late 1130s, recounted a terrifying and very specific story. He told of a priest who had a terrifying encounter one night. He saw a vast procession of souls, men and women, suffering terrible punishments and bearing heavy burdens. The priest recognized this ghostly army as the legendary Familia Herlani, the household of King Herla, a name linked to the myth of the Wild Hunt. The priest admitted he had often laughed at such stories until he witnessed it himself. You can feel his terror, the cold wind howling, the sound of invisible horses, the clink of harness, and the groans of this spectral army passing him in the dark. Now, Orderic, being a good monk, intellectualizes this. He frames it as a Christian lesson, a vision of souls in purgatory, yet he is using a very clear folkloric motive, a ghostly cavalcade led by a legendary figure, Herla. This shows that what one person calls fairies, or the merry company, another person might call spirits of the restless dead. It is a very blurry, very spooky line. The landscape of England, with its ancient rolling hills, its mysterious stone monuments, and its deep-cut earthworks, seemed to the medieval imagination to bear the marks of much larger, much older hands. If fairies and elves were the spirits of the small hidden places, then giants were the spirits of the vast and the obvious. Giants in particular are deeply embedded in English folklore. Nearly every region, every shire, boasted of a local giant in its legends, often used to explain unnatural-looking features or ancient ruins that were simply too big to have been built by ordinary men. The roll call of English giants is long. We have already met Gog-Magog, or sometimes Gog and Magog, said to be two giants subdued by Brutus's Trojan settlers. This story, which fixed them in London's civic mythology, was just one version. Remember Coroneus, the companion of Brutus, who wrestled the Cornish giant Gog-Magog and hurled him from a cliff. That story, recorded by Geoffrey of Monmouth, fixed a very real place name, the Giant's Leap, into a grand pseudo-history. To the popular mind, giants were the old ones. They were the original inhabitants of the land, a race of primordial beings who lived before the coming of civilized men. They were the builders of the prehistoric stone circles and the massive earthen mounds that medieval people encountered with a sense of profound awe. Imagine being a medieval farmer. Your whole life lived within a 10-mile radius. You stand at the foot of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain. You have no concept of Neolithic engineering or glacier-moved stones. You just see these massive, massive sarsens, each weighing many tons, balanced impossibly on top of each other. The scale of it is terrifying. The wind whistles through the uprights, a low, mournful sound. The air is cold, and the stones themselves feel ancient, radiating a kind of dead, stony chill. You can feel the sheer crushing weight of them just by looking. Who could have done this? The answer was obvious. Giants. It had to be giants. A medieval legend provided a very specific and very odd story for it. So when Geoffrey of Monmouth, our old friend, claimed that the stones originally came from Africa, they had been set up in Ireland by a group of giants who had brought them there. These stones, called the Giant's Dance, had magical healing properties. The story goes that the British king, Aurelius Ambrosius, wanted a grand memorial for his slain nobles. His wizard, Merlin, advised him to fetch these stones. When the British army failed to move them, Merlin used his magic and perhaps his engineering know-how to dismantle the circle and magically transport it across the sea, re-erecting it on Salisbury Plain. It is a charming and completely bonkers fusion of giant myth, wizardry, and political history. The historians still debate the purpose of Stonehenge, of course, but for medieval folk, the Giant's Dance was a perfectly good explanation. Giants were also credited with superhuman feats of engineering and sometimes sheer destructive landscaping. Who dug the great ditches and earth banks that cut across the countryside? Well, in Sussex, folklore said the devil, who was often interchangeable with a giant in these stories, dug the massive trench known as the Devil's Ditch. He was supposedly trying to dig a channel from the sea to flood the Weald and drown all the pious Christians. He was thwarted, as the devil often is in folklore, by a clever trick, usually involving an old woman with a candle or a rooster crowing early, making him think dawn had come. In other tales, two quarrelsome giants, perhaps living on neighboring hills, would get into an argument and start lobbing boulders at each other. Those boulders, of course, were the rocky outcrops, the tors, or the strange isolated stones that lay strewn across the countryside. Through such stories, medieval folk made sense of their environment. They acknowledged the presence of a deep, mysterious past in the very land they farmed. Those boulders, those mounds, those standing stones, they were not just rocks, they were evidence. They were integrated into a mythic, narrative framework that made the world feel older, deeper, and more storied. And if giants personified this primordial strength, this raw, earth-moving power, then dragons, as we will see, symbolized a different kind of ancient terror. The Old English rhyme, "Fee, fee, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman," is famous from later fairy tales like Jack and the Beanstalk, but it immortalizes the threatening, cannibalistic cry of an English giant. The roots of these stories lie in much older storytelling traditions, a deep-seated fear of the brute, primal forces of the world, forces that could build monuments or devour you all on a whim. Historians still debate whether these giant legends contain a dim folk memory of earlier, larger peoples, perhaps the Bronze Age builders themselves, or if they are purely ideological myths, simple stories to explain why a hill is shaped in a funny way. Either way, for the medieval mind, the land was not empty, it was haunted, and it was shaped by the massive sleeping forms of giants. But if giants were the personification of primordial earthly strength, dragons symbolized something else. They were mystery, terror, and chaos. Dragons in English folklore range from the cosmic and symbolic to the intensely local and specific. On the one hand, you have the most famous dragon story of all, St. George and the Dragon. This legend, which was imported from the wider pan-European world, became England's favorite tale of heroic knightly combat. The story is simple and powerful: a brave Christian knight, a pagan town, a maiden sacrificed to a terrible dragon, and the hero who slays the beast, saving the maiden and converting the town. It is the perfect symbol of Christian triumph over evil, of order over chaos, of light over darkness. By the later Middle Ages, St. George was officially England's patron saint, and the dragon was his heraldic foe, a creature to be endlessly defeated on banners and in plays. But beyond St. George's more generic continental dragon, many English shires had their own worms. And these were often very different. The Old English word worm meant a dragon, but it also meant a serpent or a snake. These local worms were often more serpentine, more grounded in the landscape. They were not just random monsters. They belonged to a specific hill, a particular pond, or a certain well. For example, the folklore of northern England gives us the terrifying Lambton worm of County Durham. This legend, first written down in the 19th century, but clearly drawing on a much, much older oral tradition, is rich with medieval elements and cautionary themes. The story begins with the young heir, John Lambton, a rebellious and impious lad who one Sunday skips church to go fishing in the River Wear. He catches nothing, until finally he hooks a strange eel-like creature. It is small, black, and hideously ugly, with a face like a serpent. Disgusted and cursing his bad luck, he unhooks it and foolishly throws it down a nearby well, which became known as the Worm Well. Soon after, filled with remorse for his misspent youth, John Lambton joins the Crusades and is gone for many years. In his absence, the worm in the well grows and grows. It becomes a monstrous, massive serpent that poisons the water. It finally crawls out, a vast, slimy beast, and begins to terrorize the countryside. It wraps its enormous body around a local hill, which is still called Worm Hill today, and demands tribute. It is said the worm would coil around the hill 9 times, and it demanded a daily tribute of the milk of 9 cows poured into a great stone trough. If the milk was not provided, the worm would destroy livestock and even snatch children. The land is gripped by fear. Imagine the feeling of it. You are a farmer. You cannot let your children play outside. You have to carry your milk, which you desperately need for your own family, to the monster on the hill. You can hear its vast, slithering movements in the dark. You can smell its breath on the wind, a foul, sulphurous stench of the deep earth and the grave. The air itself feels poisoned, heavy with dread. John Lambton eventually returns from the Crusades, a changed man, a hardened knight, and a good Christian. He is horrified to find the devastation his youthful mistake has wrought. He resolves to kill the beast. But the worm has a terrible magical property. When knights had tried to fight it before, any piece cut from its body would simply rejoin the whole. Lambton seeks the guidance of a local wise woman, or sometimes a hermit. She tells him how to defeat it, but her advice comes with a terrible, very odd and specific catch. He must wear a suit of armor covered in sharp, gleaming razor blades or spikes. He must fight the worm in the middle of the river Wear, so that as he cuts pieces from it, the current will wash them away before they can rejoin. And then the grim part, after he slays the beast, he must vow to kill the very first living thing he sees. If he fails to do this, his family, the Lambtons, will be cursed for 9 generations. No heir of the family will die in his own bed. Lambton agrees. He dons the spiked armor and wades into the cold river, the water swirling around his waist. The worm, drawn by the challenge, uncoils from its hill and slithers into the water, its massive head rearing up. The battle is terrible. The worm wraps its vast, crushing coils around the knight, trying to squeeze him to death. But the harder it squeezes, the more the razor-sharp spikes on the armor slice into its flesh. Lambton, meanwhile, hacks at the beast with his sword. The river runs red with its foul blood, and the current, as predicted, carries the severed pieces away. Finally, with a great agonizing hiss, the worm is destroyed. Exhausted, Lambton wades to the shore and blows his horn, the signal of victory. He had arranged for his father to release a hound, which would be the first thing he saw and killed, thus fulfilling the vow. But his old father, overjoyed at seeing his son alive, forgets the instruction. He runs out himself to embrace his victorious son. John is horrified. He cannot kill his own father. He cannot break the vow. He waits, and a moment later the hound, finally released, comes bounding up. Lamto kills the faithful dog. But it is too late. It was not the first living thing he saw. And so the legend goes, the curse took hold, and for 9 generations the lords of Lambton met with untimely, violent ends. Historians still debate the meaning of these local worm legends. Are they personifications of floods, plagues, or other natural disasters? Or are they, as some suggest, a folk memory of conflicts, perhaps with Norse raiders or even a local tyrant reimagined as a monstrous dragon? Whatever their origin, they served a purpose. The fact that a prominent local family, the Lambtons, was tied to the story lent it credibility, and for them, a great deal of prestige. They were descended from the man who saved the entire region. But besides the great dragons and the earth-moving giants, English tales featured a whole bestiary of other monstrous beasts, creatures that were often one of a kind and tied to a specific location, or worse, were omens of doom. A prime example, and one of the most terrifying figures in all of English folklore, is the black dog. This is a spectral nocturnal hound, an apparition said to prowl the lonely roads, ancient trackways, and churchyards of the countryside. Different regions gave it different names. In East Anglia, it was the terrifying black shuck. In Yorkshire, it was sometimes called padfoot for the heavy, soft, shushing sound of its paws. And in the north, it was often the barghest. But the descriptions from all over the country converge on a chillingly similar image. This is a huge, shaggy dog, as big as a calf or even a small horse. It is coal black, so dark it seems to drink the moonlight, and its eyes are the worst part, described as glowing orbs of fire, sometimes red, sometimes green, or a sickening yellow. Unlike a flesh-and-blood wolf or a stray mastiff, this apparition had unnatural qualities. It might vanish into thin air or change its size or glide along the path without making a sound despite its name, Padfoot, and to see it Well, to see it was a terrible omen. It was almost universally a portent of death. If you saw the black shuck, you or someone in your family would be dead before the year was out. This creature gives form to all the primal fears of traveling alone in the dark. Imagine you are on a lonely road, a narrow track between high hedges. The moon is hidden by clouds, and the only sound is your own breathing and the crunch of your boots on the gravel. Suddenly, you feel it. A cold, heavy presence. You smell something sharp and animal, like wet fur, and something vaguely like burnt sulfur. You look, and there it is, standing in the path. It is massive, a solid block of shadow, and two red embers are glowing in the dark. Fixed on you, your blood runs cold, your skin prickles, and you cannot move. You are frozen, your heart hammering against your ribs so hard it hurts. The creature just watches you, silent, unmoving, and then, as slowly as it appeared, it turns and dissolves back into the shadows. You would run all the way home, bar the door, and spend the night shaking by the faint light of the fire. The most famous and supposedly real encounter with this beast was recorded in East Anglia. On a terrible, stormy night in 1577, Black Shuck himself infamously burst into the church at Bungay. The account, written not long after, describes a dreadful tempest, with lightning and thunder that shook the congregation. As the people prayed, a horrible, fiery apparition of a black dog appeared in the church. It ran down the aisle, past the terrified parishioners. It wrung the necks of two people who were kneeling in prayer, killing them instantly, and caused the steeple to collapse. It then fled, leaving a trail of destruction, and supposedly flew to the nearby church at Blythburgh, where it killed more people and left great black claw scorch marks on the church's north door, marks that are still pointed out to tourists today. That is a pretty good way to liven up a dull sermon, I suppose. While this account is from the post-medieval period, it was clearly drawing on a much older and very real folk belief in a fiendish hound that haunted churchyards and lonely roads. Historians still debate what really happened at Bungay. Was it a freak electrical storm, perhaps ball lightning interpreted through a lens of folklore? Or was it simply a very good story that got better with every telling? In the learned medieval imagination, these black dogs were often seen as familiars of witches, or even as a shape-shifting form of the devil himself, out hunting for souls. And then we have mermaids. They occasionally swim through English folklore, though they are perhaps more common in maritime cultures and in classical mythology. But mermaids were certainly known to English folk by the later Middle Ages. Unlike the beautiful romantic figures of later stories, these mermaids were often considered omens of doom. A mermaid sighted off the coast, especially when wailing or singing, meant a terrible storm or a disaster was coming. It was a sign to the sailors to get back to port, if they could. There is an odd and rather poignant 15th century English ballad that tells of a mermaid who prophetically tries to warn a ship of an impending storm. But the sailors misunderstand her. Perhaps they think she is a demon or just a strange fish. They ignore her and sail on to meet their doom. It is an unusual twist, the monster trying to be helpful but failing. It is possible that on inland waters, the idea of a fish-tailed woman simply blended with those water fairies or river hags we met earlier, like Jenny Greenteeth. No one was eager to find out. Finally, we should mention the other fabulous animals that entered English folklore, partly from the misty medieval bestiaries, which were books of beasts, and from tales told by returning crusaders. No peasant ever saw a unicorn, but they readily told stories of one-horned beasts in distant lands whose horns could purify poison. This is a case of scholarly lore from classical writers filtering down into popular folk belief. Closer to home were rumors of woodwoses, hairy wild men of the woods who lived like beasts, and great wyverns, which were two-legged winged dragons, often said to guard treasure in ancient barrows. Some English church carvings even depict these woodwoses and dragons, implying these creatures were part of the visual folk culture, reinforcing those old oral tales. It's all about imagery. And in all these great stories of monsters and giants, one can see a sense of both caution and awe. They provided thrills and moral lessons, but they also served to explain what was unexplainable. A lightning-scarred hilltop becomes a giant's battleground, a strange skeleton unearthed by a plow. What is it? It has to be a dragon's remains. And indeed, Historians and paleontologists have noted that dinosaur bones or mammoth fossils unearthed in later centuries were sometimes displayed in churches or town halls as giant's bones or dragon's bones. It is a wonderful example of folklore providing a ready-made box to put a new, confusing discovery into. Of course, a world filled with such fearsome monsters and giants requires heroes. It needs characters who can stand against the chaos, and English folk legend is overflowing with them, figures who became central to the collective memory, often in direct combat with the very giants and beasts we have just met. Every culture's folklore features heroes who reflect its values, its hopes, and its deepest anxieties. And in England, two figures stand above all others, having attained a truly immortal status. One is a king, the ruler of Britain's mythic past, and the other is an outlaw, the defiant spirit of the medieval forest, King Arthur and Robin Hood. They are very different men from very different classes, but they both straddle that blurry, wonderful line between history and legend, and both have ancient roots that flowered into a rich and complex folklore. Let's start with King Arthur. As we mentioned briefly at the beginning, he started as a shadowy war leader, a dux bellorum in the early medieval Welsh stories, a figure of resistance. But by the 12th century, thanks to writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth, he had been completely transformed into the magnificent centerpiece of grand chivalric romances. To the medieval English folk, Arthur became a paradoxical figure. On the one hand, high literature and court entertainment portrayed him in shining chivalric splendor. This was the Arthur of Camelot, the founder of the Round Table, the king who presided over a court of noble knights like Lancelot and Gawain. This was a king who embodied the ideals of justice, piety, and military prowess. But that was the king of the court. Local folklore, the stories told by the common people, often localized Arthur in a much more intimate and gritty way, rooting him firmly in the landscape. Hundreds of sites across Britain are named for him, from hills called Arthur's Seat to springs called Arthur's Well, and every single one of them has a legend that goes with it. In England's West Country, in Cornwall and Somerset, the old Celtic heartlands, people whispered a powerful story. They said Arthur was not dead. He was merely sleeping. He was hidden away in a deep cave, perhaps under Glastonbury Tor or beneath a remote hill, surrounded by his loyal knights, all in their armor, their horses beside them. They were just waiting, sleeping through the ages, until the day of Britain's greatest need, when Arthur would rise again. You can almost imagine a farmer, lost on the moors, stumbling into a hidden cave to escape a storm. He lights a torch, the flame sputtering in the damp air, which smells of wet stone and cold ancient dust. The light falls on ranks of sleeping men in old-fashioned rusting armor, their chests rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. He hears the soft jingle of a harness, the sigh of a sleeping warhorse, and he is overcome with a profound, terrifying awe. He would flee, of course, sealing the cave entrance behind him, telling no one, lest he wake the king too soon. This powerful folkloric motive, the sleeping hero, attached itself to Arthur with incredible strength. Well into the 14th and 15th centuries, there was a very real popular belief in Arthur's eventual return. It was a hope for a kind of messianic renewal. This belief was so strong and so politically inconvenient for the Norman rulers, who wanted to stamp out any lingering Celtic nationalism, that an official solution was needed. This leads to a very famous historical event. In 1191, the monks of Glastonbury Abbey announced they had found a grave, and not just any grave. They claimed to have dug down and found a massive, hollowed-out log coffin containing the bones of a huge man, and beside him the smaller skeleton of a woman with a lock of golden hair. An odd lead cross found with them was said to be inscribed, "Here lies the renowned King Arthur, buried in the Isle of Avalon." This was almost certainly a brilliant and cynical hoax, a fantastic bit of public relations by the monks, perhaps to draw in pilgrims and their money after a fire, and to please their royal masters by proving definitively that Arthur was dead and buried. He was history. He was not coming back. Yet, ironically, this attempt to kill the myth only transitioned Arthur onto an even more mythic plane. Because if the literary Arthur was a king, and the Glastonbury grave made him a corpse, the folk Arthur had a third, much darker identity. In some rustic stories, especially from the wilder parts of the land, Arthur was not a noble king at all. He was a ghostly figure. He was the leader of the wild hunt, that terrifying spectral cavalcade we have met before. An English courtier, Walter Map, writing around the same time as the Glastonbury discovery, recorded one such tale. He tells of a spectral company known as the Herlethingis, the household of King Herle, an ancient Briton king whom Map essentially equates with Arthur. This King Herle, through a rash pact with a fairy king, is cursed to wander the earth, leading his host of spirits, never resting. And here Arthur, or Herle, becomes a cursed wandering figure, a ghostly hunter galloping across the night sky during winter storms, his hounds baying, hunting the souls of the damned. You would be huddled in your cottage, the wind screaming in the chimney like a human voice. You would hear it far off at first, the sound of a hunting horn, and the frantic, echoing bark of a dozen hounds, a sound that makes your blood freeze and your heart stop. You would pull the blankets over your head and pray, because to see the wild hunt was to be snatched up by it, or to be struck dead by the sheer terror. Historians still debate the origins of the wild hunt, but most agree it is a Christian reimagining of a much older pagan idea, perhaps the god Woden or Odin, leading his own ghostly procession across the sky. The noble King Arthur in this folk tradition was demoted, blended with a pagan god, and turned into a bogeyman, a cautionary legend about a prideful king. This dual identity, the once virtuous ruler of Camelot and the eerie, damned leader of the ghostly hunt, shows the incredible multivalence of folklore. A single figure could be a hero, a sleeping messiah, and a terrifying demon, all depending on who was telling the story and why. But if Arthur was a hero of the distant mythic past, tinged with melancholy and the grand tragedy of his kingdom's fall, then Robin Hood is the complete opposite. He is the exuberant, living, breathing hero of the common man. Robin Hood, the legendary outlaw of Sherwood Forest, or as the earliest ballads actually state, the Forest of Barnesdale in Yorkshire, is perhaps the most beloved figure in all of English folklore. He is first mentioned in surviving medieval texts by the late 14th century. In William Langland's great poem, Piers Plowman, written around 1377, a lazy and ignorant priest admits that while he does not know his prayers very well, he does know the rhymes of Robin Hood. This is a critical clue. It tells us that by the 1370s, Robin's tales were already so widespread in oral tradition, so well known among ordinary people, that even a slacker priest knew them by heart. These stories were not coming from the court. They were bubbling up from the villages, the taverns, and the marketplaces. The early Robin Hood ballads, some of which survive from the 15th century, paint a very specific picture of our hero, and this is important. This Robin Hood is not a nobleman in disguise, not the dispossessed Earl of Huntingdon that later, more aristocratic stories would make him. The medieval folk hero Robin was a yeoman, that is, a free man of common birth, a skilled archer, and a proud, defiant leader of a band of outlaws living rough in the greenwood. He was the quintessential cunning hero, clever, bold, and fiercely anti-authoritarian. He and his merry men, the core group being Little John, Much the miller's son, and Will Scarlet, lived outside the law. They poached the king's deer, a crime punishable by blinding or hanging. They robbed wealthy, powerful travelers, but they did not rob just anyone. Their targets were very specific: corrupt officials, fat abbots, and especially their great nemesis, the Sheriff of Nottingham. The ballads show Robin killing, or more often humiliating and outwitting, these representatives of oppressive authority, and then crucially he would share the captured loot with the neediest of peasants. This is the heart of his legend, that famous motto of robbing the rich to give to the poor. It is a powerful fantasy of medieval wealth redistribution, carried out with a longbow. This theme resonated incredibly strongly in an era of great inequality, social unrest, and hardship. We have to remember that the Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a massive violent uprising against taxes and serfdom, occurred at almost the exact same time as Robin Hood's legend was first emerging. While Robin is not mentioned in the revolt itself, later generations clearly projected that same rebellious, anti-establishment spirit onto him. To the medieval village folk, who lived hard lives under the boot of a lord and the threat of a reeve, Robin's stories were both escapism and a powerful social commentary. They were a way to fantasize about turning the tables on the people who pushed them around. Imagine the feeling of it, the life of an outlaw. You are living in the deep forest. You wake up not in a smoky, dark hut, but under the trees. The air is cold and damp with morning mist, so thick you can taste the wet earth and decaying leaves on your tongue. Your clothes are perpetually damp. Your muscles ache from sleeping on the hard ground. You are always hungry, always listening. Every snap of a twig could be one of the sheriff's men. You spend your day hunting, not the Lord's protected deer, but your own. You feel the smooth, worn wood of the yew longbow in your grip, the stretch of the string against your fingers. The thwack of the arrow hitting its mark is the most satisfying sound in the world. It is the sound of food, of freedom, of defiance. That night you are gathered around a hidden fire. The smell of roasting venison, a forbidden, delicious, fatty smell, fills the clearing. You are drinking rough ale from a stolen barrel, and the firelight dances on the faces of your friends, your brothers, in this greenwood life. You are laughing, singing a rude song about the sheriff. For this one moment you are a king in your own right, richer than any lord because you are free. That is the feeling the Robin Hood stories captured, but Robin Hood's legend was not just confined to oral songs. It moved into the culture of popular folk festivals. By the 15th century, villages all across England were incorporating Robin Hood pageants and games into their annual festivities, especially around Mayday. This was a time of celebration of the return of spring. In some spring festivals, a man, usually a popular local, would be elected Lord of Misrule or May King, and often he would take on the guise of Robin Hood. He would preside over a day of carnivalesque games, archery contests, and general merriment. Records from church wardens in the early 16th century, which is just after our medieval period but reflects older customs, show expenses for costumes for Robin Hood plays. These were likely bawdy comic scenes of the outlaw and his companions. And it is probably through these very May games that two other famous characters joined the band, Friar Tuck and Maid Marian. They are not in the earliest, grimmest ballads. Friar Tuck, the fat, drunken, ale-loving fighting cleric, was a perfect figure for these folk carnivals. He was a hilarious parody of the wealthy, corrupt churchman that people loved to mock. And Maid Marian, she was likely an extension of the May Queen, the young woman chosen to preside over the spring fertility rites. In fact, an odd and a very telling detail is that in many of these early village plays, the part of Maid Marian was often played by a man in drag, as cross-dressing and role reversal were a huge part of the world-turned-upside-down theme of Mayday. Historians still debate the great question, was Robin Hood a real person? The answer is probably not, at least not a single one. But there may have been many real-life outlaws whose stories were blended together. Others have speculated links between Robin Hood and even older figures, perhaps a green man or a Jack in the Green, a spirit symbolizing the wildness and rebirth of nature. After all, he wears Lincoln green and he haunts the greenwood. But what is clear is that by the late medieval period, Robin Hood had become a powerful symbol of the free spirit of the forest, beloved in the popular imagination, and because he had no single author, no one official text, the story remained folk property. It could be changed, added to, and respun with every telling, which is precisely why he is still with us today. But it was not just the grand, sweeping legends of kings like Arthur or national outlaws like Robin Hood that captured the imagination. Folklore is also intensely local, and alongside these big names, there are a host of other legendary figures, local heroes, and even saints, whose stories became deeply woven into the fabric of English folk belief. These figures often started as real historical people, but their lives and deeds were so remarkable or so symbolic that folklore adopted them, polished them, and turned them into legends. A fantastic example is Hereward the Wake, a very real 11th century rebel. He was an Anglo-Saxon thane who led a fierce, desperate resistance against the Norman conquerors in the 1070s. He based his rebellion in the fens, the vast, marshy, impenetrable wetlands of East Anglia, and he quickly gained a legendary reputation as a brilliant guerrilla fighter, a master of the swamp. Later chronicles and popular ballads sung in taverns for centuries turned Hereward into a larger-than-life figure. They called him the last Englishman, the final man to stand against William the Conqueror. The stories told of his daring raids, his clever disguises, and his ability to appear and vanish like a ghost in the fog. He became the symbol of lost Anglo-Saxon liberty. Imagine being a Norman soldier sent to hunt him. You are in a flat-bottomed boat, poling through a dense gray mist. The air is completely silent except for the drip of water from your pole and the rustle of the endless reeds which tower over your head. The water's black and still, and the whole world smells of cold mud and decaying vegetation. You feel a creeping dread, the cold seeping into your bones, not just from the damp, but from the feeling of being watched. You know Hereward and his men are out here somewhere, hidden, moving silently on wooden stilts or in shallow boats, and that by the time you see them, it will be too late. That is the legend Hereward built. He was the spirit of that landscape, a man who became one with the wild fens to fight an impossible war. Then we have Lady Godiva. She was also a real person, a noble Anglo-Saxon woman in the 11th century, known for her piety and her generosity to the church in Coventry. But the story for which she is famous is pure folklore, and it is a wonderful one. The legend, first recorded centuries after her death, so we must take it with a grain of salt, tells that her husband, Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, was oppressing the people of Coventry with a harsh tax. Godiva pleaded with him to lower it, but he refused. Finally, exasperated, he told her he would grant her request only if she would ride naked through the marketplace, assuming, of course, that she would never do it. But she did. She issued a proclamation that all citizens must stay inside and shutter their windows. Then she let down her long hair to cover herself as much as possible and rode her horse through the silent, empty streets of the town. You can just imagine the feeling. The shocking, biting cold of the morning air on her skin, the hard, unnatural silence of the town at midday, a time when it should be bustling. The only sound is the clatter of her horse's hooves on the cobblestones, an echoing, lonely sound that seems incredibly loud. She is completely vulnerable, sacrificing her own dignity and honor for her people. This is a story about compassion and about the power of a bold, subversive act by a woman in a world run by men. And of course, the legend acquired an extra, very odd, and very famous detail. Only one man, a tailor named Tom, dared to disobey. He bored a hole in his shutters to spy on her as she passed, and for his trouble he was struck blind on the spot. This is where we get the term Peeping Tom. Historians still debate the origin of this tale. It is almost certainly not literally true, but it is a powerful piece of folklore, a moral about humility, generosity, and the terrible price of voyeurism. And finally, folklore even attached itself to saints. Certain saints, especially English ones, had legends that were more folk tale than formal religion. A perfect case is Saint Dunstan, a real and very powerful Archbishop of Canterbury in the 10th century. But in popular legend, he was remembered not just as a statesman, but as a clever blacksmith who repeatedly outwitted the devil himself. The most famous story recounts how, one day, Dunstan was working at his forge. He was a skilled smith, the story says. The devil came to his door, disguised as a traveler, and asked Dunstan to shoe his horse. Dunstan, of course, recognized his true identity. The devil then revealed his own cloven hoof and asked to be shod. Dunstan agreed. He heated a horseshoe in the forge until it was glowing white-hot. Imagine the scene, the roar of the bellows, the intense, shimmering heat, the sharp, metallic tang of the hot iron. Then Dunstan seized the devil's hoof. Instead of just nailing the shoe on, he nailed it deep and painfully into the quick, with the devil screaming in agony. The devil begged for release. Dunstan, holding the devil fast, refused until Satan swore a mighty oath. He swore he would never ever enter a place where a horseshoe was hung above the door, and only then did Dunstan, with a grim smile, release him. This wonderful earthy story is a classic example of folklore at work. It is a how and why story, a clever, humorous tale that explains the common folk practice of nailing a horseshoe over the door for good luck, framing it as a Christian act of warding off the devil thanks to a tough-as-nails English saint. So, we have these heroes, these larger-than-life figures, but folklore is also something lived, something practiced by the entire community. It is found in the rituals and customs that mark the passage of the year, the great turning wheel of the seasons. For the medieval community, these festivals were everything. They were the glue that held society together, reinforcing social bonds, celebrating the cycles of nature, and just as importantly, keeping those very old beliefs subtly alive, often under a thin new Christian veneer. Let's start with the end of the dark time, the dead of winter. After the cold and stillness of midwinter, people looked with desperation for the first signs of renewal. Candlemas on February 2nd was one, but for farming communities, the real folk celebration was Plow Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany in early January. This was the ritual start of the plowing season. It was part blessing, part festival, and part, well, a little bit of a shakedown. The young plowmen of the village would drag a decorated plow, sometimes called the fool plow, through the village streets. They would be led by a man dressed as a plow fool, or sometimes as an old woman called Bessing. They would go door to door, dancing and singing and demanding pennies, or more likely, ale and food at every house. This was both a way to bless the fields and a day of licensed misrule, and it had an edge. It was considered very bad luck and very rude to refuse them. And in an odd and vaguely threatening detail, those who did refuse might find their own doorstep or garden patch plowed up by the angry plowman as a prank. Imagine that, the sound of the heavy iron plow blade biting into the frozen mud right outside your door, a very clear message that you had broken the rules of the community. You are snug inside your hut. The fire is going and the air smells of wood smoke and the stew you have bubbling for your family. Then you hear it, a rough, discordant sound of men singing and the clatter of wood and iron. You peek out the door, and the blast of icy January wind makes your eyes water. It carries the sharp metallic smell of the cold plowshare, the damp woolly smell of the men's cloaks, and the strong sour-sweet scent of the ale on their breath. They are stamping their feet to stay warm, their faces red, shouting and laughing as they demand their due from your neighbor. You hurry to fetch them a mug of ale and a piece of bread, not just out of charity, but from a real prickling fear of what they might do if you do not. As winter finally turned to spring, you had Shrovetide, the days just before Lent. This was the last great party before the 40 days of pious austerity. Shrove Tuesday, or Pancake Day, as it is still often called, was a time of feasting. People would use up all the rich foods in the house, the eggs, the fat, the milk, by making pancakes. But it was also a day of wild, chaotic games. In many towns, this was the day for a massive town-wide football game, and we are not talking about a polite, organized match. This was medieval street football. Hundreds of men, apprentices, and laborers would pour into the streets. The ball was often just an inflated pig's bladder. The goals might be the two ends of the town or two specific landmarks miles apart. It was a riot. You can just imagine the sound. A great roaring wave of shouting men, the thud of dozens of heavy boots on the packed earth streets, the crushing weight of the scrum as everyone pushed and shoved, trying to move the ball. The air would be filled with the smell of sweat, wet leather, and the garbage that littered the streets. It was a glorious, violent, and messy release of pent-up energy, the perfect way to blow off steam before the quiet and hunger of Lent began. Then, as spring truly arrived, we come to perhaps the most important folk festival of the year, Mayday, on the 1st of May. This was the great, joyous celebration of the return of life and fertility. At dawn, or even the night before, the young people of the village would go a-maying. This meant going out into the woods to gather hawthorn blossoms, which were called the May, and armfuls of greenery and flowers to decorate the village. You can picture it. You wake in the pre-dawn chill, the air still and gray, but you can feel the new warmth in it. Your feet are bare and sink into the cold, wet dew of the grass as you run towards the woods. The forest is just beginning to wake up, the only sound the sharp, clear song of the birds. You smell the rich, damp earth and the sharp, clean scent of crushed leaves underfoot. And then you find the hawthorn in full, glorious bloom. The fragrance is overpowering, a sweet, almost almond-like scent that fills your head. Your hands get cold and sticky with sap as you pull down the branches, laughing with the other youths, your heart feeling as light and green as the leaves around you. Back in the village, the main event was erecting the maypole. This was a tall, tall pole, a straight tree trunk stripped of its branches, which was set up in the village green. It was garlanded with all the flowers and greenery you had just gathered. This was the center of the day's dancing. The image of ribbons being woven around the pole is actually a later addition, but the act of dancing around this great phallic symbol of fertility is clearly, unmistakably, a relic of ancient pagan tree worship. The church, of course, was not thrilled. Later, Puritans would famously condemn maypoles as stinking idols, but in the medieval period, the church mostly just tolerated it as a harmless bit of fun. A May Queen would be chosen, a young girl to preside over the day, and sometimes a May King who, as we have discussed, was often linked to Robin Hood. And then there were the Morris dancers. Men, and it was almost always men, would perform energetic, leaping jigs. They would be dressed in their best, with bells strapped to their legs and waving white handkerchiefs or clashing sticks. The sound of it was a rhythmic jangling, the jingle, jangle, clack of bells and wood, a sound that was supposed to drive away the last spirits of winter and wake up the earth for the planting season. The first clear record of Morris dancing in England is from 1448, when Morris dancers were paid at court, but the tradition is almost certainly much, much older. Historians still debate the origin of its name. The word Morris might be a corruption of Moorish, suggesting to some an influence from Spanish or North African dances. Others argue it just meant Morisco or grotesque, referring to the painted faces or black face that some dancers wore, perhaps as a form of disguise to trick evil spirits. Either way, it was a vital part of the spring celebration. Finally, as spring turned to the peak of summer, you had Midsummer, the feast of St. John the Baptist, around June 23rd and 24th. But everyone knew what it was really about, the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. On Midsummer Eve, the whole community would light massive bonfires on hilltops. This is another practice with clear, blazing pagan roots, a fire festival to honor the sun at its peak. The church, in a clever move, tolerated it by dedicating the fires to St. John. People would leap through the flames or smoke, a dangerous, thrilling act that was believed to bring protection from evil and ensure a good harvest. Cattle might be driven through the smoke to purify them. It was a night of magic. The veil between worlds was thin. Herbs gathered at midsummer, like St. John's wort, were thought to be especially potent against fairies and witches. You can feel the heat of that fire in your face, a scorching, dry blast that makes you squint. The air is thick with the sharp, resinous smell of burning wood. You see the sparks, a great, writhing column of red and gold shooting up into the darkening sky, and for a moment you feel connected to something ancient and wild. It was a holy day for sure, but it was also a carnival, a night of firelit dancing, drinking, and magic under the stars. As the heat of midsummer faded and the long days of summer began to ripen into harvest, a whole new set of local customs sprang up, all designed to give thanks for the food and to ensure future fertility. The most joyous of these was the harvest home, also called the ingathering. This was the great celebration at the very end of the grain harvest, usually around late August or early September. After the last back-breaking sheaf of corn was finally cut, the farm laborers would load it onto the final cart and bring in the harvest load, but they would not do it quietly. They would come in shouting, singing, and blowing horns. It was a procession of pure, unadulterated triumph. The last sheaf itself was often treated with special reverence. It would be woven into a small humanoid figure, a corn dolly, and dressed in ribbons. This figure was called the Corn Maiden, or the Harvest Queen, and was carried in that final procession. Imagine being one of those reapers. You have been working in the field since before dawn for weeks. Your back is a single, solid knot of pain. Your hands are rough and cracked, bleeding from the sharp, dry stalks. The air is thick with the smell of the cut grain, a dry, dusty, sweet smell that gets in your throat and makes you cough. The sun has been beating on your neck, and you are so tired you can barely stand. Then the last stalk is cut. A great ragged cheer goes up from all the workers. Suddenly, your exhaustion is replaced by a wild, giddy joy. Someone hands you a horn, and you blow it with all your might, a loud, blaring, tuneless blast of victory. You are all singing and shouting as the cart, piled high with golden sheaves and the little corn dolly perched on top, rumbles back towards the barn. The farmer or the lord, for this one night, has provided the best. There are barrels of strong ale and tables groaning with food. The feasting and drinking would follow, and this was a time of temporary, wonderful equality. The master and his servants, the lord and his tenants would all dine together, sharing the same food and the same ale, celebrating the harvest that would keep all of them alive through the winter. This custom of the corn dolly is a fascinating, odd detail. Folklore held that the spirit of the corn, the very life force of the crop, lived in the grain. As the reapers moved across the field, the spirit would retreat until it was finally trapped in the very last sheaf. By cutting that last sheaf and weaving it into a dolly, the reapers were catching the spirit. They were not killing it, they were preserving it. That corn maiden would be hung in the farmhouse or the barn, kept safe all through the dark winter, and then, come spring, it might be plowed back into the first furrow, releasing the spirit back into the earth to make the new crops grow. Historians still debate the true origins of this. Is this a genuine dim memory of an ancient pre-Christian ritual, perhaps even a substitute for a long-forgotten animal or human sacrifice to the corn god? Or is it a more simple, symbolic act of thanksgiving, a pretty custom whose original meaning was lost even to the medieval people who practiced it? Either way, it shows a deep personal connection to the land and the cycle of growth. But as the days shortened and the last of the harvest was gathered, the mood began to change. The year was dying. This brought the communities to All Hallows Eve, or Halloween, on October 31st. This night, the eve of the Celtic New Year, Samhain, marked a critical turning point. It was a night when the veil between this world and the next was at its thinnest, when ghosts, fairies, and all sorts of supernatural beings were believed to roam the earth. For the medieval church, the following 2 days were the important ones. November 1st was All Saints' Day, a feast to honor all the saints. And November 2nd was All Souls' Day, a solemn day of prayer for the souls of the departed, especially those believed to be in purgatory. But as always, folk customs thrived right alongside the official religious observances. In England, the most important medieval practice for this time was souling. This custom is a beautiful and slightly spooky blend of Christian piety and older folk tradition. On All Souls' Day, or sometimes on All Hallows' Eve itself, the poor and often children would go a-souling. They would go from door to door, from one wealthy house to the next, and they would offer to pray for the souls of that family's departed kin. In exchange for the service, they were given food, and specifically small spice cakes called soul cakes. You can just hear them. A small group of children huddled in the cold November twilight. The air is sharp with the first real frost, and it smells of wood smoke and damp, decaying leaves. They are standing at a brightly lit doorway, their voices thin and reedy as they sing their traditional song, "A soul, a soul, a soul cake, pray you, good mistress, a soul cake." In return, the lady of the house would come out. You would smell the wonderful, warm, spicy scent of the cakes, rich with nutmeg and raisins, a comforting aroma in the cold, dark night. She would hand a cake to each child, and they would promise to pray for her father's soul or her dead husband's. There was a genuine belief, or at least a popular notion, that for every cake eaten, a soul was freed from the fires of purgatory. This gave a real comfort to the living, and it reflected the era's intense concern and anxiety for the fate of the dead. But souling also had that quasi-spooky, supernatural element. There was a lingering feeling that if you did not offer the soul cakes, the restless spirits themselves might get angry and play tricks on you. Nothing too bad, but maybe they would sour your milk or rattle your door. We can see here the clear, direct ancestor of modern-day trick-or-treating with its blend of charity, a hint of a threat, and going house to house. And in an even more striking parallel, some of these souling groups would carry lanterns. But these were not made of pumpkins, which were not in Europe yet. They were made from hollowed-out turnips with a grotesque face carved into them and a small candle glowing inside. These, it was said, represented the souls in purgatory. Or perhaps, in a much older pre-Christian echo, they were carried to ward off the evil spirits that were also roaming on this magical, dangerous night. And so, as the year turned and the nights reached their absolute darkest and longest, the community gathered together for the final great celebration, the heart of the dark half of the year, Yuletide. This was the 12-day festival stretching from Christmas Eve to the 12th night, which is January 6th. Medieval Christmas was a rich, chaotic, wonderful mix of sacred and profane celebration. It was a little bit recognizable to us, but also a lot wilder. People would deck their halls, and this was not just a metaphor. They would bring in armfuls of greenery, holly, ivy, and mistletoe. The sharp, green, waxy smell of the holly and the earthy scent of the ivy would fill the smoky, dark halls, a bright splash of living color against the cold stone and the dark wooden beams. This was a powerful symbol, bringing the evergreen, the sign of life, into the house during the dead of winter. Mistletoe, of course, was a special case. It was a sacred plant to the ancient Druids, a plant of magic, and somehow it found its way into Christmas. The custom of kissing under the mistletoe is first clearly attested in the 18th century, so it is a bit later, but it likely evolved from much older, forgotten fertility symbolism. It was a little bit of pagan magic, hiding in plain sight. The main order of the day was feasting, music, and games, all of it designed to be a defiant roar of joy against the darkness and the cold. But the most spectacular and bizarre custom of the medieval Christmas was the crowning of a lord of misrule. In this tradition, documented in medieval and Tudor times, was pure sanctioned chaos. A figure, often a local peasant, a servant, or sometimes even a subdeacon, would be elected or appointed to lead the Christmas revels. His entire job for the 12 days was to turn the normal order of the world completely upside down. Under the Lord of Misrule's reign, the high and the low mingled. Servants might order their masters about. A mock court would be held where the Lord of Misrule would issue silly, ridiculous decrees. This tradition is a clear descendant of the late Roman festival of Saturnalia, where for a brief time slaves were allowed to act as masters. It was a crucial psychological safety valve for a very rigid hierarchical society. By letting the world go completely topsy-turvy for just a few days, society could reassert its strict order for the rest of the year. It must have been an incredible sight, the Great Hall, which was usually a place of formal, stiff manners, suddenly filled with shouting, laughter, and people wearing their clothes backwards, all led by a village fool with a paper crown, who for this 1 week was the most powerful man in the county. English folklore also brought us the mumming plays during the Christmas season. Mummers, a word that probably comes from the Middle English mome, meaning to wear a mask, were troops of amateur actors. They were usually local youths or members of a village guild, and they would perform short, very strange comic dramas in exchange for food, ale, or a few coins. The classic Mummers play, which was written down in various forms in the 18th century but almost surely performed in a similar way much earlier, features a set cast of characters. You would have a hero, often St. George, and an antagonist, like a Turkish knight or a villain named Slasher. And then you would have a quack doctor. Imagine this. You are in the great hall. It is warm and packed with people. The air is thick. You can barely breathe. It smells of sweat, spilled ale, wet wool, and the hot, fatty aroma of the roasting goose on the great fire. Suddenly, the door crashes open, letting in a blast of freezing December air. A group of men stumbles in. They are disguised in bizarre, gaudy costumes made of rags and ribbons, or sometimes paper. Their faces are hidden, either with masks or blackened with soot. They are clumsy and loud, and they smell strongly of the ale they have been given at the last 5 houses. They clear a space and begin their play. St. George, or a local hero, boasts arrogantly. The Turkish knight boasts back. They fight clumsily with wooden swords. The clack, clack, thwack of the wood echoes in the room. Then the hero's killed. He falls to the floor, dead. The audience groans, but then a comic quack doctor, Dr. Brown, is called in. He boasts of his ridiculous cures. I have a little bottle in my pocket, he might say, called Elecampane. It will raise any dead man to life again. He gives the dead man a swig from his bottle, and miraculously, he leaps back to life. Everyone cheers, the play is over, and the mummers pass the hat around. This little drama, with its added comic fools like a character named Beelzebub or a man with a hobby horse, is a very old, very strange piece of folk theater. Historians still debate its true meaning, but at its core, it is a death and resurrection play. It is a ritual, a folk magic performance of life triumphing over death, performed in the dead of winter. Finally, another Christmas folk custom was wassailing. This wonderful word, wassail, comes from the Old English wes hel, which means be healthy. It was a toast, a bit like saying cheers or good health. And the custom took two forms. First, there was the house visiting wassail. A group of wassailers, like carolers, would carry a huge wassail bowl of spiced ale or cider. This was not a delicate drink. This was hot, strong, sweet ale, thick with roasted apples, spices, and sugar. They would go door to door, singing and offering a drink from the communal bowl in exchange for gifts or just good wishes. It was a way of sharing a blessing for the new year with all your neighbors, along with a healthy dose of alcohol and song, a perfect social glue. But the second form, orchard wassailing, was far stranger and far more pagan in flavor. This was common in cider-producing regions like Somerset or Kent. On Twelfth Night, the farmers and their workers would go out to the orchard, to the apple trees. They would sing to the trees, sometimes reciting a chant, "Here's to thee, old apple tree." They would pour cider on the roots of the king tree of the orchard, and they would hang pieces of cider-soaked toast in its branches as an offering for the birds, or perhaps for the tree spirit itself. And then, in an odd and very loud detail, they would make a huge noise. They would bang pots and pans, or in later times, fire shotguns into the branches to scare away any evil spirits that might be lurking and to wake up the tree, to ensure a good harvest of apples in the coming year. It is a beautiful, practical, and deeply animistic ritual, a clear sign that people saw the trees as living beings that needed to be fed, cheered up, and protected. It is a perfect example of how folk practice connected people intimately with the land, half in earnest, magical prayer, and half in the good humor of a rowdy, drunken winter's night. Well, we have saved the most intimate layer till last. Beneath all the grand legends of heroes and the great communal festivals is the other side of folklore. That is the everyday magic and superstition that pervaded medieval life. In an age with few scientific explanations for disease, disaster, or sudden fortune, people often turned to folk magic. This was a practical, quiet mix of inherited pagan practices and adaptive Christian prayer, all to try and influence the vast, unseen forces that seemed to control their lives. This realm of folklore deals with the little things, the charms, the omens, the witches, and the small protective actions woven into daily existence. Virtually every community, from the smallest village to a crowded town, had someone reputed to have special knowledge. They were called a wise woman or a cunning man, a herb wife, or sometimes just the healer. These practitioners of folk medicine and magic occupied a respected, if sometimes feared, place in society. They would craft herbal remedies for ailments, recite charms for healing, help find lost objects, and maybe even offer a bit of fortune-telling. Their lore was almost entirely oral, handed down through apprenticeships or family lines. Much of it, in hindsight, was effective practical knowledge. They knew which plants, like willow bark, could soothe pain, or how to set a broken bone. But this practical knowledge was always couched in ritual to give it power. For a fever, a wise woman might brew you a potion of yarrow tea. But she would also insist that you drink it only at sundown, while she recited a psalm backwards or muttered an old charm under her breath. The feeling of her presence would be as much a part of the cure as the tea. Imagine her small, smoky hut. The air is thick, almost unbreathable, with the smell of 100 different dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It is a complex, dusty, pungent aroma of mint and sage and something unpleasantly bitter, all mixed with wood smoke. Her hands are gnarled and stained dark brown from plants. As she works, her voice is a low, rhythmic drone, a sound that is both comforting and a little bit frightening. For a difficult childbirth, a family might place a written charm, perhaps a saint's name or a biblical verse, under the birthing bed. Or they might call in the wise woman to lift a curse, a malefice believed to be blocking the birth. The church, for its part, tacitly allowed many of these practices as long as overt pagan references were left out. Healing was a good thing. However, when these wise folk strayed too far, when they got into love spells or curse lifting that seemed to invoke spirits, or worst of all, claiming to harm people with magic, well, that was a line the clergy did not want them to cross. Charms and amulets were everywhere. An infant might have an amulet of red coral, or a smooth, strange-looking wolf's tooth hung around its neck on a leather thong. This was to ward off the evil eye, a very real fear. The evil eye was the belief that a malignant, envious glance from a neighbor could cause harm, could make your child sicken or your milk dry up. Farmers, as we know, nailed horseshoes over the barn door, just like in the St. Dunstan's tale, to protect the livestock from witches or mischievous fairies. Iron in general was considered a powerful protective metal against all forms of enchantment. Perhaps it was the cold iron that repelled fairies in the legends. People would drive iron nails into their doorsteps or carry a small knife on their person, not just for practical reasons, but to feel more secure against the unseen world. You would feel the hard, cold weight of that iron in your pocket, a small, solid piece of reality to hold onto in the dark. Of course, crucifixes and holy water were the church's official protective tools, but in folk usage they took on a magical tinge too. Holy water was not just for official blessings. You would sprinkle it in the corners of a room to banish a suspected ghost or to cleanse a haunted house. The sign of the cross became a superstitious gesture as much as a devotional one. One crossed oneself reflexively when speaking of the devil, or when hearing a strange noise at night, just in case an evil spirit was passing by. Widespread folk beliefs attached to animals and plants. A howling dog under the window at night was a terrible sign, a death omen, and so was a bird, especially a raven or a pigeon flying into the house. If that happened, you would feel a sudden cold knot of dread in your stomach, a certainty that someone in the family was doomed. But on the beneficial side, the ash tree was thought to have protective powers. There was an odd practice in some parts of England where infants with rickets or a rupture would be passed through a cleft in a living ash sapling. This was a kind of sympathetic healing. The tree would then be bound up. The belief was that as the tree healed and grew, so would the child. We also find clear remnants of pagan worship in these folk beliefs. The veneration of wells and springs remained incredibly strong. People would drop pins or small coins or tie little scraps of cloth called cloudies to a nearby tree as offerings to the spirit of the well for healing. Although these practices were often officially redirected, with the wells being rededicated to saints, becoming St. Mary's Well or St. Anne's Well, the underlying idea of a spirit or magical force residing in the water persisted. Now that line between white magic, which was beneficial, and black magic, the malicious brand, was very blurry in folklore. Most people would readily seek a wise person's help to break a curse, but they would be swift to condemn a neighbor they suspected of ill-wishing their cow or causing a child to sicken through envy. The belief in witchcraft, that is, people who made pacts with evil forces to harm others, certainly existed in medieval England. But it would only reach the hysterical, terrifying heights of the great witch hunts in the later early modern era. In the medieval period, action was more local. If a farmer's cow suddenly stopped giving milk, he might suspect the evil eye from a spiteful old woman in the village. He might then consult a cunning man to counteract the witch's spell. The cunning man might advise placing a hag stone, which is a stone with a natural hole, over the barn door, since such stones were believed to repel witches. Or, in a more aggressive, odd, and very unpleasant bit of magic, he might instruct the farmer to create a witch bottle. This was a glazed jar filled with the victim's urine, some pins, and perhaps nail clippings. This bottle would then be heated by the fire. In the folk magic theory, this would torture the witch by proxy, causing her unbearable pain and force her to lift the spell. Another figure bridging religion and folklore is the ghost, and medieval England was full of them. Catholic doctrine allowed for the concept of ghosts, but they were typically seen as souls from purgatory, returning for some unresolved matter or to seek prayers. Folklore, of course, eagerly expanded on this. We have already met the revenants, the physical, walking corpses. William of Newburgh in the 1190s recounted multiple cases of the dead returning in bodily form. These were not romantic, ethereal spirits. They were terrifying, and they had to be dealt with by physical means, like digging up the corpse and performing a ritual, or by spiritual means. One memorable story from Newburgh tells of a wicked man in Buckinghamshire who died and rose nightly. He would climb into bed with his poor wife and lie on top of her, crushing her with his cold, dead weight. He then roamed the village, spreading panic. The problem was only solved when the Bishop of Lincoln provided a written letter of absolution, which was placed on the corpse's chest in its grave, finally quelling the restless dead. These beliefs served to reinforce social norms and, perhaps, to discourage nighttime wandering. It was just safer to stay inside. And so our journey through the winding lanes and misty forests of English folklore comes to a gentle close for tonight. We have seen how these beliefs were not just simple stories, but the very fabric of how people understood their world, a world that was brimming with magic, with danger, and with wonder. We met the fairies, those powerful, unpredictable beings, from the helpful, fussy brownie by the fire to the terrifying, child-stealing sprites in the wild. We stood in the shadow of giants who shaped the very hills and stones of the land. We heard the roar of the worm and the spectral cry of the black dog on a lonely road. We followed the greenwood path with Robin Hood, a hero for the common man, and we slept with Arthur, the king beneath the hill, a symbol of eternal hope. We danced around the maypole to welcome the spring, and we lit the bonfires at midsummer, reaching back to a time of ancient memory. And finally, we saw the quiet everyday magic, the charm whispered over a sick child, the horseshoe nailed to the door, the coin tossed into a sacred well. These were the ways that ordinary people in their hard and uncertain lives found a small measure of control, a sense of meaning, and a deep connection to the land and to each other. These stories, these rituals, these quiet superstitions, they are the whispers of 1,000 generations. And as you find yourself drifting off now into that quiet space between waking and sleeping, perhaps you can feel that connection too. The world is indeed an old and storied place, but for now, it is time to rest. Good night.